Friday, November 25th, 2022. I'm Larissa, and we are reading To a God Unknown by Mr. John Steinbeck. Chapter 19. The summer dragged wearily on, and even when the autumn months came, the heat did not grow less. Burton came back exalted from the camp-meeting town of Pacific Grove. He described with enthusiasm the lovely peninsula and the blue bay, and he told how the preachers had given the word to the people. "Sometime," he said to Joseph, "I'll go up there and build a little house, and I'll live there all year round. A number of people are settling there. It'll be a fine town someday." He was pleased with the baby. "It's our stock," he said, "just a little changed." And he boasted to Elizabeth, "Ours is a strong stock. It comes out every time. For nearly 200 years now, the boys have had those eyes." "They aren't far from the color of my eyes," Elizabeth protested. "And besides, babies' eyes change color as they get older." "It's the expression," Burton explained. "There's always the wan expression in the eyes." "When will you have him baptized?" "Oh, I don't know. Maybe we'll be going to San Luis Obispo before very long. And, of course, I'd like to go home to Monterey for a visit sometime." The day's heat came early over the mountains and drove the chickens from their morning talking on manure piles. By 11 it was unpleasant to be out in the sun, but before 11 Joseph and Elizabeth often took chairs out of the house and sat under the shading limbs of the great oak. Elizabeth engaged in the morning nursing then, for Joseph liked to watch the baby sucking at the breast. "It doesn't grow as fast as I thought it would," he complained. "You're too used to the cattle," she reminded him. "They grow so much more quickly, and they don't live very long." Joseph silently contemplated his wife. "She's grown so wise," he thought. "Without any study, she's learned so many things." It puzzled him. "Do you feel very much different from the girl who came to teach school at Nuestra Senora?" he asked. She laughed. "Do I seem different, Joseph?" "Why, of course." "Then I suppose I am." She changed the breast and shifted the baby to the other knee, and he struck hungrily at the nipple like a trout at a bait. "I'm split up," Elizabeth went on. "I hadn't really thought of it. I used to think in terms of things I had read. I never do now. I don't think at all. I just do things that occur to me. What will his name be, Joseph?" "Why," he said, "I guess it'll be John. There has always been either a Joseph or a John. John has always been the son of Joseph, and Joseph the son of John. It has always been that way." She nodded, and her eyes looked far away. "Yes, it's a good name. It won't ever give him any trouble or make him embarrassed. It hasn't even much meaning. There have been so many Johns, all kinds of men, good and bad." She took the breast away and buttoned her dress, and then turned the baby to pat the air bubbles out of him. "Have you noticed, Joseph, Johns are either good or bad, never neutral? If a neutral boy has that name, he doesn't keep it. He becomes Jack." She turned the baby around and to look in its face, and it squinted its eyes like a little pig. "Your name is John, do you hear?" she said playfully. "Do you hear that? I hope it never gets to be Jack. I'd rather you were very bad than a Jack." Joseph smiled amusedly at her. "He has never sat in the tree, dear. Don't you think it's about time?" "Always your tree," she said. "You think everything moves by order of your tree." He leaned back to look up into the great tender branches. "I know it now, you see," he said softly. "I know it now so well that I can look at the leaves and tell what kind of day it will be. I'll make a seat for the baby up in the crotch. When he's a little older, I may cut steps in the bark for him to climb on. But he might fall and hurt himself. Not from that tree. It wouldn't let him fall." She looked penetratingly at him. "Still playing the game that isn't a game, Joseph?" "Yes," he said, "still playing. Give the baby to me now. I'll put him in the arms." The leaves had lost their shine under a coat of summer dust. The bark was pale, gray, and dry. "He might fall, Joseph," she warned him. "You forget he can't sit up by himself." Burton strolled up from the vegetable patch and stood with them, wiping his wet forehead with a bandana. "The melons are ripe," he said. "The coons are getting at 'em, too. We'd better get some traps." Joseph leaned toward Elizabeth with his hands outstretched. "But he might fall," she protested. "I'll hold him. I won't let him fall." "What are you going to do with him?" Burton asked. "Joseph wants to sit him in the tree." Instantly, Burton's face grew hard and his eyes sullen. "Don't do it, Joseph," he said harshly. "You must not do it." "I won't let him fall. I'll hold him all the time." The perspiration stood in large drops on Burton's forehead. Into his eyes there came a look of horror and of pleading. He stepped forward and put a restraining hand on Joseph's shoulder. "Please, don't do it," he begged. "But I won't let him fall, I tell you. It isn't that. You know what I mean. Swear to me that you won't ever do it." Joseph turned on him irritably. "I'll swear nothing," he said. "Why should I swear? I see nothing wrong in what I do." Burton said quietly, "Joseph, you have never heard me beg for anything. It isn't the manner of our family to beg. But now I am begging you to give up this thing. if I am willing to do that. You must see how important it is. His eyes were wet with emotion. Joseph's face softened. If it bothers you so much, I won't do it, he said. And will you swear to never do it? No, I won't swear. I won't give up my thing to your thing. Why should I? Because you're letting evil in, Burton cried passionately. Because you're opening the door to evil, and things like this will not go unpunished. Joseph laughed. Then let me take the punishment, he said. But don't you see, Joseph, it isn't only you. All of us will be in the ruin. You're protecting yourself, then, Burton? No, I'm trying to protect all of us. I'm thinking of the baby and of Elizabeth here. Elizabeth had been staring from one to the other of them. She stood up and held the baby against her breast. What are you two arguing about? She demanded. There's something in this I don't know about. I'll tell her, Burton threatened. Tell her what? What is there to tell? Burton sighed deeply. On your head, then. Elizabeth, my brother is denying Christ. He is worshipping as the old pagans did. He is losing his soul and letting in evil. I am denying no Christ, Joseph said sharply. I'm doing a simple thing that pleases me. Then the hanging of sacrifices, the pouring of blood, the offering of every good thing to this tree is a simple thing. I've seen you sneak out of the house at night. I've heard you talk to this tree. Is it a simple thing? Yes, a simple thing, Joseph said. There's no hurt in it. And the offering of your own firstborn child to the tree, is that a simple thing too? Yes, a little game. Burton turned away and looked out over the land where the heat waves were so intense that they were blue in color, and their twisting made the hills seem to writhe and shudder. I've tried to help you, he said sadly. I've tried harder than Scripture tells us to. He swung back fiercely. You won't swear, then? No, Joseph replied. I won't swear to anything that limits me, that cuts down my activity. Surely I won't swear. Then I cast you out. Burton's hands hid in his pockets. Then I won't stay to be involved. Is what he says true? Elizabeth asked. Have you been doing what he says? Joseph gazed moodily at the ground. I don't know. His hand arose to caress his beard. I don't think so. It doesn't sound like the thing I've been doing. I've seen him, Burton cut in. Night after night, I've seen him come out into the dark under the tree. I've done what I can. Now I'm going away from this wrong. Where will you go, Burton? Joseph asked. Harriet has $3,000. We'll go to Pacific Grove and build a house there. I'll sell my part of the ranch. Maybe I'll open a little store. That town will grow, I'll tell you. Joseph stepped forward as though to intercept his resolve. I'll be sorry to think I've driven you away, he said. Burton stood over Elizabeth and looked down at the child. It isn't only you, Joseph. The rot was in our father, and it was not dug out. It grew until it possessed him. His dying words showed how far he had gone. I saw the thing even before you ever started for the West. If you had gone among the people who knew the word and were strong in the word, the thing might have died, but you came here. His hands swept out to indicate the country. The mountains are too high, he cried. The place is too savage, and all the people carry the seed of this evil thing in them. I've seen them, and I know. I saw the fiesta. I know. I can only pray that your son will not inherit the rot. Joseph resolved quickly. I will swear if you will stay. I don't know how I'll keep it, but I'll swear. Sometimes, you see, I might forget and think in the old way. No, Joseph, you love the earth too much. You give no thought to the hereafter. The force of an oath is not strong in you. He moved away toward the house. Don't go, at least until we talk this over, Joseph called, but Burton did not turn to answer him. Joseph looked after him for a minute before he turned back to Elizabeth. She was smiling with a kind of contemptuous amusement. I think he wants to go, she said. Yes, that's partly it, and he really is afraid of my sins, too. Are you sinning, Joseph? He scowled and thought, No, he said at last. I'm not sinning. If Burton were doing what I am, it would be a sin. I only want my son to love the tree. He stretched out his hands for the baby, and Elizabeth put the swathed little boy in his hands. Burton looked back as he was entering his house, and he saw Joseph was holding the baby within the crotch of the tree, and he saw how the gnarled limbs curved up protectingly about it. Chapter 20. Burton did not stay long on the ranch after his mind was made up. Within a week he had all his things packed and ready. On the night before his departure he worked late, nailing the last of the boxes. Joseph heard him walking about in the night, chopping and hammering, and before daylight he was up again. Joseph found him in the barn, currying the horses he was to take, while Thomas sat nearby on a pile of hay and offered some short advice. That Bill will tire soon. Let him rest every little while until he gets well warm. The team has never been through the pass. You may have to lead them through. But maybe not, now that the water is so low. Joseph strolled in and leaned against the wall under the lantern. "I'm sorry you're going, Burton," he said. Burton rested his currycomb on the horse's broad rump. "There's a good many reasons for going. Harriet will be happier in a little town where she can have friends to drop in on. We were too cut off out here. Harriet has been lonely." "I know," Joseph said gently, "but we'll miss you, Burton. It will cut the strength of the family." Burton dropped his eyes uneasily and went back to currying. "I never wanted to be a farmer," he said lamely. "Even at home, I thought of opening a little store in town." His hands stopped working. He said passionately, "I've tried to lead an acceptable life. What I have done because it seemed to me to be right. There is only one law. I have tried to live in that law. What I have done seems right to me, Joseph. Remember that. I want you to remember that." Joseph smiled affectionately at him. "I'm not trying to keep you here if you want to go, Burton. This is a wild country. If you do not love it, there's only hatred left. You've had no church to go to. I don't blame you for wanting to be among people who carry your own thoughts." Burton moved to the next stall. "It's turning light," he said nervously. "Harriet is getting breakfast. I want to start as soon after daylight as I can." The families and the riders came out into the dawn to watch Burton start away. "You'll come to see us?" Harriet called sadly. "It's nice up there. You must come to visit us." Burton took up the lines, but before he clucked to the horses, he turned to Joseph. "Goodbye. I've done right. When you come to see it, you'll know it was right. It was the only way. Remember that, Joseph. When you come to see it, you'll thank me." Joseph moved close to the wagon and patted his brother's shoulder. "I offered to swear, and I would have tried to keep the oath." Burton raised the lines and clucked. The horses strained into the collars. The children, sitting on the road, waved their hands, and those who were to stay ran behind and hung to the tailboard and dragged their feet. Rama stood waving a handkerchief, but she said aside to Elizabeth, "They wear out more shoes that way than by all the walking in the world." Still, the family stood in the morning sunlight and watched the departing wagon. It disappeared into the river wood, and after a while it came in sight again, and they saw it mount a little hill and finally drop from sight over the ridge. When it was gone, a listlessness came over the families. They stood silently, wondering what they should do now. They were conscious that a period was over, that a phase was past. At length the children moved slowly away. Martha said, Our dog had puppies last night," and they all ran to see the dog, which hadn't had puppies at all. Joseph turned away at last, and Thomas walked with him. "I'm going to bring in some horses, Joe," he said. "I'm going to level part of the vegetable flat so the water won't all run off." Joseph walked slowly with his head down. "You know I'm responsible for Burton's going." "No, you aren't. He wanted to go." "It was because of the tree," Joseph went on. "He said I worshipped it." Joseph's eyes raised to the tree, and suddenly he stood still, startled. "Thomas, look at the tree." "I see it. What's the matter?" Joseph walked hurriedly to the trunk and looked up at the branches. "Why, it seems all right." He paused and ran his hand over the bark. "That was funny. When I looked at it, I thought something was wrong with it. It was just a feeling, I guess." And he continued, "I didn't want Burton to go away. It splits the family." Elizabeth passed behind them toward the house. "Still at the game, Joseph?" she called mockingly. He jerked his hand from the bark and turned to follow her. "We'll try to get along without another hand," he told Thomas. "If the work gets too much for us, I'll hire another Mexican." He went into the house and stood idly in the sitting room. Elizabeth came out of the bedroom, brushing her hair back with her fingertips. "I hardly had time to dress," she explained. She looked quickly at Joseph. "Are you feeling badly about having Burton go?" "I think I am," he said uncertainly. "I'm worried about something, and I don't know what it is. Why don't you have a ride?" "Haven't you anything to do?" He shook his head impatiently. "I have fruit trees coming to Nuestra Senora. I should go in for them." "Why don't you go then?" He walked to the front door and looked out at the tree. "I don't know," he said. "I'm afraid to go. There's something wrong." Elizabeth stood beside him. "Don't play your game too hard, Joseph. Don't let the game take you in." He shrugged his shoulders. "That's what I'm doing, I guess. I told you once I could tell weather by the tree. It's a kind of ambassador between the land and me. Look at the tree, Elizabeth. Does it seem all right to you?" "You're overwrought," she said. "The tree is all right. Go in and get the fruit trees. It won't do them any good to be standing out of the ground." But it was with a powerful reluctance to leave the ranch that he hitched up the buckboard and drove to town. It was the time of flies, when they came active before winter death. They cut dazzling slashes in the sunlight, landed on the horses' ears, and sat in circles around their eyes. Although the morning had been cool with the sharpness of autumn, the Indian summer sun still burned the land. The river had disappeared underground, while in the few deep pools that remained, the black eels swam sluggishly, and big trout mouthed the surface without fear. Joseph drove his team at a trot over the crisp sycamore leaves. A foreboding followed him and enveloped him. Maybe Burton was right, he thought. Maybe I've been doing wrong. Without knowing it, there's an evil hanging over the land, and he thought, I hope the rain comes early and the stars, and starts the river again. The dry river was a sad thing to him. To defeat the sadness, he thought of the barn, piled to the roof trees with hay, and of the haystacks by the corral, all thatched against the winter, and then he wondered whether the little stream in the pine grove still ran from its cave. I'll go up and see pretty soon, he thought. He drove quickly, and he hurried back to the ranch, but it was late at night when he arrived. The tired horses hung down their heads, and when the check reins were loosened, Thomas was waiting at the stable entrance. You drove too fast, he said. I didn't expect you back for a couple of hours. Put up the horses, will you? Joseph asked. I'll pump some water on these little trees. He carried an armload of the switches to the tank and saturated their burlap root coverings with water, and then he went quickly toward the oak tree. There is something wrong with it, he thought fearfully. There's no life in it. He felt the bark again, picked off a leaf, crumpled and smelled it, and nothing appeared wrong. Elizabeth had his supper ready almost as soon as he went into the house. You look tired, dear. Go to bed early. But he looked over his shoulder with worried eyes. I want to talk to Thomas after supper, he said. And when he had done eating, he walked out past the barn and up on the hillside. He felt with his palms the dry earth still warm from the day's sun, and he walked to a copse of little live oaks and rested his hand on the bark and crushed and smelled a leaf of each. Everywhere he went, inquiring with his fingers after the earth's health. The cold was coming in over the mountains, chilling the grasses, and on this night Joseph heard the first flight of wild geese. The earth told him nothing. It was dry but alive, needing only the rain to make it shoot its spears of green. At last satisfied, he walked back to the house and stood under his own tree. I was afraid, sir, he said. Something in the air made me afraid, and as he stroked the bark, suddenly he felt cold and lonely. This tree is dead, his mind cried. There is no life in my tree. The sense of loss staggered him, and all the sorrow he should have felt when his father died rolled in on him. The black mountains surrounded him, and the cold gray sky and the unfriendly stars shut him down, and the land stretched out from the center where he stood. It was all hostile, not ready to attack, but aloof and silent and cold. Joseph sat at the foot of the tree, and not even the hard bark held any comfort for him. It was as hostile as the rest of the earth, as frigid and contemptuous as the corpse of a friend. Now what will I do, he thought. Where will I go now? A white meteor flared into the air and burned up. Perhaps I'm wrong, Joseph thought. The tree may be all right after all. He stood up and went into the house. And that night, because of his loneliness, he held Elizabeth so fiercely in his arms that she cried out in pain and was very glad. Why are you so lonely, dear? She asked. Why do you hurt me tonight? I didn't know I was hurting you. I'm sorry, he said. I think my tree is dead. How could it be dead? Trees don't die so quickly, Joseph. I don't know. I think it is dead. She lay quietly after a while, pretending to be asleep, and she knew he was not sleeping. When the dawn came, he slipped out of bed and went outside. The oak leaves were a little shriveled, and some of their glossiness was gone. Thomas was on his way to the stable, saw Joseph, and walked over. By George, there is something wrong with that tree, he said. Joseph watched anxiously while he inspected the bark and the limbs. Nothing to kill it here, Thomas said. He picked up a hoe and dug into the soft earth at the base of the trunk. Only 2 strokes he made and stepped back. There it is, Joseph. Joseph knelt down beside the hole and saw a chopped path on the trunk. What did it? He demanded angrily. Thomas laughed brutally. Why, Burton girdled your tree. He's keeping the devil out. Joseph fanatically dug around with his fingers until the whole path of the girdle was exposed. Can't we do something, Thomas? Wouldn't tar help it? Thomas shook his head. The veins are cut. There's nothing to do. He paused, except beat hell out of Burton. Joseph sat back on his heels. Now that it was done, the muffling calm settled over him, the blind inability to judge. That was what he was talking about then, about being right. I guess it was. I'd like to beat hell out of him. That was a fine tree. Joseph spoke very slowly, as though he pulled each word out of the swirling mist. He wasn't sure he was right. No, he wasn't sure. It wasn't quite his nature to do this thing, and so he will suffer for it. Won't you do anything at all to him? Thomas demanded. No. The calm and the sorrow were so great that they bore down on his chest, and the loneliness was complete, a circle impenetrable. He will punish himself. I have no punishments. His eyes went to the tree, still green but dead. After a long time he turned his head and looked up to the pine grove on the ridge, and he thought, I must go there soon. I'll be needing the sweetness and the strength of that place. Religious zealots. They're always the same. And, it doesn't matter which group they're from, even from pagans, Pagan religious zealots are every bit as bad as Christian ones or Buddhist ones or Hindu ones or Jewish ones. Like, religious extremism is terrible. Also worried because he was talking to a tree. Burton. What a jerk. What a jerk. And of course, there's the whole thing. Elizabeth, I don't even think anymore. All I am is a mummy. But I suppose that will suit her in her position. I suppose so. That's her business. But the undercurrent of the sexism of, what a waste to have that girl having been learned, having her learned anything. That's that type of attitude is very destructive to women. Anyway, the tree. The tree.